Hi everyone. Nice to see you all today.
So David Berzaval, it's lovely to see you. Lovely to see you again. Karina Cox, lovely to see you. Kath Backhouse, Tess Harris.
Sarah Allport, hello, lovely to see you.
So just so that we know that you're actually out there and you're actually talking to us today, we've got the question and answer. You know, you can actually like sort of type in, how's the weather today in your place? I mean, Steve Mann, you're in London there, yeah? Just contact us and tell us if it's gorgeous sunshine, if it's absolutely horrible and you know, like sort of weighing it down outside. If you could just put into the Q&A how you're finding things.
Sunny in Aston, oh, I'm jealous. I'm in Liverpool and it's literally just been white clouds. Oh, that's nice to see. Hello.
Nice day in sunny St Albans.
Oh, it looks like there might be a bit of a north-south divide here. Sunny down south.
Still warm in Spain. Okay, Sean, we're not jealous at all. Okay, so we're going to kick off in literally 20 seconds. And then we'll run. Hi, Doliana. We're going to run for exactly an hour. So we'll make sure we finish on time. Okay, over to you then, Helen, and let's go for it.
Oh, okay. Well, firstly, just wanted to say thanks all for being here. It's great to see so many of you on this sort of September afternoon. So yeah, thanks for sort of giving your time this afternoon, and I'm hoping we'll have a really good sort of conversation discussion today as well. Using the chat and Q&As and polls, we'll be hoping for lots of interaction from you today. So before we get right onto the subject of impact and finance, just wanted to say a little bit about us. This is what the webinar is going to look like today. So some of you might be familiar with this, but just very briefly, we're the Mortensen Smith Fundraising Management team. So as you can see, we kind of come at things from 3 different angles. I'll choose impact first, because I'm on the impact team with Carl and Penny, you can see there. We've got a fundraising team with Dan and Emma, and last but not least, definitely Mark. We've got Mark and Marcus on the finance team as well. And we kind of work together, helping charities and other kind of not-for-profit organisations work through problems, think about kind of solutions and all the good stuff, really. So today, as I say, we're looking for quite a sort of interesting interactive webinar, and we're really keen to hear your thoughts on impact and finance and how they kind of interact. So if any of you are on Twitter, it would be great to hear from you through social media as well. So you can see there you've got our handle, which is @MKSFM Consulting, and if you can use that hashtag as well, then it'll all kind of link up together, and we can all kind of get a conversation going on Twitter, and after the webinar as well. That'd be really great.
So hang on one second there, Helen, yeah? And we said that we'd have a bit of an interaction between the two of us as well today. This is the first time that we have ever tried to use a Twitter handle. It's the first time that we've ever used a handle with, you know, @MKSFM Consulting. And so please, if you agree with us, put a comment in there. If you disagree with us, put a comment in there. Have a conversation with us, because we just want to try it out. It's something that we're trying that's new, and we just want a better standard of conversation. So please just engage, yeah? You know, and let's have a look at afterwards. We'll respond to, you know, whoever tweets us. Yeah, and thank you for your engagement. We're just trying something new today.
Absolutely. All right, thanks, Mark. With that all over with, let's kind of get to the crux of the matter. So we've got this kind of standard spectrum here, really, the head versus heart spectrum, and we thought it might be really interesting, just before we go any further, if we just start off with a poll. So I'm going to launch the polling now. And you should be able to see this question in front of you. So, is your organisation driven more by the impact or by the money? and we want you to be truthful, and especially truthful following COVID-19. So how are we doing? We've got, oh, it's quite an interesting balance here. Yeah, got 80% voted. So I'll just leave it on for another few seconds just to let everyone decide. All right, okay, so let's end the polling and look at the results. So just edging out with one more vote is a good balance between the both, and we got one, yeah, about equal of impact-driven, finance-driven. Cool, I think that's really interesting. What do you think about that, Mark?
Yeah, so you know, it's really interesting for me because I think that a lot more organizations are actually finance driven than you think that they are. I think especially after COVID-19 and especially with the environment we find ourselves, a lot of people think they're impact driven, but they're really not. I think you're being driven by the money at the you know, at the time. It's a controversial statement to make, yeah, but that's what we're going to talk about today, is how do we blend this finance piece and this impact piece and get the balance right, because I think you're more finance driven than you think you are. Anyway, back to you, Helen. Yeah,
so maybe a lot of optimism going on in the audience today, which in general we like to see. We like optimism. So yeah, this slide is really about thinking about the head versus the heart, and it's really interesting thinking about this from an impact point of view, because obviously financial information does tend to be more visible. So often decisions might be made more about things because all of the financial information is there. And if you're not measuring your impact, or if you're not as kind of au fait with the relative impact of your different activities, then maybe that might sink to the bottom. So it's a really, really interesting dynamic, and it's something that we'll be going on to talk about.
So just stick on that slide there, and then I think it's over to me in any case. So if you just go back one slide, Helen, yeah. So the thing is, we talk about this blend of head and heart. We talk about this balance between head and heart in social purpose organizations. A lot of research at the moment, specifically by people like Santos is a researcher, has said that actually this balance doesn't exist. This balance between head and heart, you can't balance it all. So Santos says you have to take a position of, you know, either the head or the heart. You know, Santos is quite focused and says, look, either you are going to be an impact focused organization, mission driven, focused on, you know, like sort of the social change that you create, and actually the money kind of is the secondary thing, or you're money driven, you get the money in, and you know how you actually spend that to create change is the secondary thing. But actually this alchemy, this holding this balance between impact and money is incredibly difficult in social purpose organizations, charities, social enterprises, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Sorry, Helen, you've got the guide. I'm going to have to ask you to go to the next slide. So next slide, please, and then next slide again. So some research that I did back at Cass Business School in 2017, and it's taken from the document you can see there. We're now talking about finance. We're now talking about this balance, and we're trying to get the sweet spot between finance and impact. The research that we completed said that finance directors are focused predominantly on finance. Well, there's no surprise there, but they are significantly less likely to think about impact than any other senior managers or trustees. And it's interesting for me to reflect that finance people, we see, for example, the number of grants, we see the number of contracts. We don't turn that, for example, into the number of people we help or the way that we help those in terms of outcomes. Yeah. So finance people, I believe, you know, are very, you know, obviously very qualified, but we see the world in terms of numbers. We're even applauded for, you know, our management accounts, but we never turn that into telling the story of the impact we create. Can I go to the next slide, Helen? And as Helen said a couple of slides ago, I think it's really interesting because we tell the story of the tip of the iceberg through financial data, through the reports and accounts, through our financial lens, and that's the very tip. And yet we're not very good at telling the story of non-financial data and what sits underneath, what sits underneath the iceberg, which is non-financial data, the impact data, and is in fact, far broader and far more interesting in some ways than the numbers and the finance. I mean, we've had a quick question in from Kath. Don't you think this has changed with more impact reporting in annual accounts? Kath, I don't actually at the moment. I think that the SORT committee are going to review this in the future, and I think you'll find that they're going to say that people are talking about outputs still. In other words, we wrote a report, but it won't say what the report changed in the world. It will say we trained 5 people, but it won't say what depth or change those people went through. And I think if we're really going to talk about impact, we need to talk about those changes that people feel. And as you can see down in the bottom right-hand corner here, somebody, for example, in Ghana, who's learning to sew, so that he has a skill and he's able to, to work, that gives well-being. It enables, for example, him to afford a little bit of education. He can actually sort of pass on money to his family, etc., etc. And the massive amount of social change we create from that is quite profound. And yet we still look at the world through financial data. Can we go to the next slide, Helen? And so here's 3 things for you to think about. First of all, I'm going to come to the bottom left-hand corner, governance. Our work has identified that charity trustees often equate stewardship with ensuring financial sustainability alone, rather than focusing on mission and impact. So one of the things that, research has shown is that actually governance and longevity makes us think much more about the finances than about what we do with those finances. Down in the bottom right-hand corner, charities need stable and predictable income streams for long-term financial sustainability. And without that, you tend to think about the finances, especially at COVID-19, and especially where we have such a difficult environment to trade in. We stop thinking, for example, about the impact. And then the very long quote at the top is very interesting. When charities feel confident about their sustainability, they then think about other things such as impact. When charities doubt their sustainability, they are significantly less likely to focus on any other strategic aims. In other words, they think about survival. On the other hand, when a charity is confident about impact, there's little bearing on how confident it feels about other aspects of its work, positive or negative. There's almost no correlation between impact and other strategic aims. And I'm a finance professional. I've worked in finance for years and years and years. I think it's really interesting that I didn't get it for years as a finance director until I suddenly sat with groups of, for example, poor people and said, that's what our finance does. It creates change for people. So I want us to be more thoughtful about how we spend the money and the change it creates and articulating that, So I want us to start to get this balance much better between impact and finance, and that's what we're going to talk about, So I hope that's been interesting and food for thought. So the 3 things really that have, I hope you picked up so far that, this balance between finance and impact doesn't really exist. You do tend to start one end or the other. At the moment, we're being forced into thinking much more about finance and also, governance and stewardship. It means that we think much more about governance, but we have to be thoughtful. We have to give time and effort to really think about the impact we create and how our spend and the dynamics changes that, and how we link the money to the impact. Cool. Back to you, Helen,
Thanks, Mark. Thanks. I think what you said at the end there was really interesting about how, as a finance director, it wasn't until you sat down with the stakeholders and you saw the impact happening person to person that you really got that side of things. And maybe towards the end of the webinar, we can sort of speak to people about if there are any sort of FDs watching, or if there are any impact people watching, how we think we might be able to kind of bridge those gaps, like that encounter that you had, which is a really interesting one. So we're going to move on to the impact side of things now. And in terms of the core elements of this, you know, really getting down to it, it's about measuring your social value. And at this point, I just wanted to hear again from the audience. So I'm going to launch another poll. And this is about actually what you're measuring. So you should be able to see it up on your screens now. And I'm interested to know whether you're measuring primarily the outputs, so the activities of your organisation. Are you measuring primarily the outcomes or the changes that are happening? Or is it the impact, which, as you can see, the impact of your organisation, we would define as the value of those outcomes that are attributable to you. So as well as thinking about the outcomes, you're also thinking about, well, how much of it is actually down to us as an organisation. And I'll just give you a few more minutes to vote on that. We're getting lots of votes going through. It's always a bit of a treat because we can kind of see it happen in real time.
Yeah. And also a great interesting comment from Claire Twelvetrees, you know, about advocacy and how do you really understand the impact of advocacy work as opposed to, for example, direct service delivery. And, you know, she's saying apart from what numbers we put in the annual reports, it's very hard to actually tell that. Our views would be welcome. So we'll come back and talk about that in a couple of seconds, yeah?
Absolutely. Okay, so let's end that polling and I'll just share the results. So this actually pretty much echoes what we've kind of found as an impact team. So organisations are generally very good at measuring outputs. They're accountable, you know, as Mark said earlier, number of reports that you've created, number of activities that you've put on, number of people who've attended and things. The outcomes, the sort of next slice along, looking at actually what's changed from that. Still a fairly decent number of people, that's great to see, got 35%. And then 16% of people are actually looking at the impact. So I think that's really interesting and hopefully will kind of frame our conversation a little bit. So let's go back to this slide. So really in terms of actually measuring your social value, we would want to start by focusing on collecting the kind of data and information that helps you to do the following things. So firstly, as those of you who are measuring your outcomes will know, it's about identifying the core changes that you're responsible for and who's experiencing those changes. So as well as your direct beneficiaries, are there loved ones, are there partnership organisations or membership organisations you share knowledge with? There's all sorts of questions there. Next one is how much change is happening. So if someone's increasing in their confidence, what do they start off as and what have they ended up as? The actual distance travelled is really, really important. And finally, the relative value of the change. So for the stakeholders themselves, which is the most important change for them? And those are the kind of main types of information that you would want to collect. So going on to the next slide, I'm going to show you here when we're thinking about how we can kind of really integrate impact within our strategy and how it can ultimately interact and inform a little bit more decisions alongside financial information. Our team at MKS have kind of come up with this approach that we call the indicative impact model, which I'll just tell you a little bit about because it might kind of help to shape your thinking if it's something that you're struggling with as well, such as exactly what Claire was saying in her question. So we've got this circle here, and it's sort of divided into quarters, which each represent the source of the information and the evidence that we're looking for. So you might kind of seek out impact information from the board and management, or the staff view. You might take a direct stakeholder view and do kind of focus groups or surveys with your stakeholders. You can look at what data you've got already, and you can also look at alternative sources. So this might be kind of university sources or information that charities similar to yourself have got, which really provide a kind of a rich source of evidence to help you to kind of come up to this next stage of the process, which is getting your outcomes chains together and really identifying out of all of these outcomes that are occurring from your activities, which are the higher value ones, and ultimately what implications does that have for your service delivery? So on the following slide, you can see that we've got a little bit of a table here, and once you've gone through that process that I just talked through on the other slides, what we come to is this kind of table where you've got each activity that your organisation does in turn going down on the left-hand side, and then these numbered columns that you can see are different kind of criteria, different impact criteria that we would identify. So when I say impact criteria, I mean things like what's the causal link like between the activity and the outcome? Out of all the stakeholders that experience the activity, do loads of them experience the outcome, i.e. the causal link is really, really strong and reliable, or do not many of them experience that outcome? So that's the first example that you can see there. If it's outcomes from a counselling session, and really a lot of the stakeholders come out thinking very differently about their life, about the problem or the issues that they're going through, then maybe the efficacy would be really high. And so if that was the first criteria, we might put a 5 out of 5 score on there, for example. One of the other impact criteria that we might use is if there's evidence of change for more than one stakeholder group. So for example, if your charity is helping people recover from substance misuse, there's a clear outcome there for the direct beneficiary, but there's also outcomes potentially for their loved ones or even for the state. So if you're collecting that kind of information, you've got strong evidence that there is impact across a range of stakeholder groups, that might be the second criteria along, and you can think about scoring that 1 out of 5. The third one is whether there's more than one source of evidence to support your claims. So if there's any other kind of reports or sources of evidence, then you can be a lot more confident in your claims. And again, that might be a criteria that you could choose to mark yourself on. And then as you work through the table, you can see that you end up with this sort of red, amber, green scoring process. And you ultimately you arrive at a score out of 30. If you score 6 criteria out of 5. And you would end up with areas that are green or amber, where you might want to think about redesigning the service, or maybe they're red and you might want to think about what you could do really differently. And what we think about this approach is it's actually a really, really good way of identifying sources of how to improve your, number one, your data collection, but number two, your services themselves. So if one of your columns is very low, then maybe you do want to think about involving loved ones, or maybe you do want to think about ensuring that the causal link is stronger. So it can be a really sort of stimulating activity as well, in terms of thinking about how to improve activities and how to kind of improve engagement and things. On the next slide though, Mark will tell you a little bit about how this then feeds into conversations to do with finance and strategy as well.
So I just wanted to come back first of all, Helen, and just talk about Claire and Jota Serrano's question, which is around, advocacy. And it's really interesting because I've been involved in 2 things when I was at CARE that were advocacy projects. And how did we measure them? I just didn't want to leave that question hanging, and then afterwards, Helen, if you technically talk about how we measure advocacy, that would be really useful. I'll give 2 practical examples. The first was advocacy of women in Peru, not having to go to a hospital in Lima, but can actually giving birth in their home communities. And, because we'd set up these clinics and there was a lot of advocacy that local people could use, their local way of giving birth, which was very important to them, standing up. We said, okay, we will advocate on behalf of these individuals and, these women. And to make sure that we actually captured the changes that they were going through, we put a telephone box in the community. So anybody could step into that telephone box, anybody could confidentially talk, anybody could talk about their experience as a stakeholder and feedback. And so the first thing about, advocacy is getting the right stakeholders so that you can ask them how the world has changed, what change this brings about. And certainly in Peru, we struggled with how we were going to measure the advocacy, and the impact or the outcomes of advocacy. That's the way that we did it. We had to find some way of doing that, but then we could articulate that on behalf of the women and the way that they were giving birth in the community. The second is peace and reconciliation work, because peace and reconciliation work, did you or didn't you start a war? That's a really hard question to answer. The work that you do on a day-to-day basis, advocating for peace, does it really make a difference? And so certainly at CARE, we used to start to ask people if they could carry a geotag, for example, a tagging system. And then we just say, walk around. If you feel safe, you'll walk to the local market. If you don't feel safe, then you'll stay in your home. So you can get a proxy, for example, for advocacy. So the two things I wanted to say, back to, Claire, and also to, Joe DeSerrano, and please feed in on the webinar chat other ways that you've got to go and ask people. Yeah, you've got to ask stakeholders, and it's the core of our methodology at MKS, Moore Kingston Smith, is go and sit down with stakeholders and ask, because then you can find the complexity and people can express themselves in a very powerful way, in the way they wish to. Yeah. So just back to you, Helen, in terms of advocacy, any other things that you want to add into that for the two people that made comments?
Yeah, I think those proxies are a really clever way of doing it, but in general, I just really advocate very kind of deep and sort of probing stakeholder engagement. I remember helping an organisation out with trying to understand what impact their campaigning had. And I think they've got a question in the House of Lords, for example, and they were working very much at a national level trying to achieve change. And, short of kind of changing a law, they were really struggling with how to measure the impact of that, because it was a very interesting part of, and a very important part of their activities, which they had a lot of belief in, but they were struggling with how to measure the impact of it. And actually, if you go to, the member of the House of Lords, or if you go to your partnership organisations and the people that you're working with, and you say, what difference has this advocacy work made on you? You end up with some really, really useful insights, whether it's, it's reduced the time needed for me to research things, because I've got this amazing charity here that gives me a short line to what's happening on the ground. So I haven't had to waste my time on that. So I've been able to spend it on other things like campaigning for you, whether it's increased confidence of people to kind of speak up and speak out on your behalf or on their own behalf, because you're helping self-advocacy. You can, if you try and speak to people, just a number of exploratory conversations, and throughout the year, maybe you can reach some sort of intermediate outcomes, which, as I say, while it might not be great, the law's changed and we can say that we were responsible for that. There's a number of kind of intermediate things there. Yeah, I'd be interested to know, Claire and Joe, whether that helps at all, or maybe, our contact details are at the end. So if you did want to have a more of an in-depth chat about your particular contacts and things like that, then do let me know.
So I mean, Helen, thank you. I think the final bit of this is as Claire's saying, about the depth of intervention, the depth of change that's happened. And the way that I like to think about it is it could be wide or deep. Yeah. So in other words, if you're creating small change across a lot of people, that might be what you're trying to achieve. Whereas actually, if what you really want to achieve is very deep change within a very small population, that's maybe a different type of intervention. So I also don't want to hide that. And I think the model I'm just about to show you will help you to see that in practice. Yeah. And so if I move us on to these next 2-3 slides, more than happy to come back to the conversation we've just been having, because it's really interesting. And advocacy is probably about as hard as it gets in terms of measuring some of the impact that you are talking about. So
if that's any consolation, Claire.
Yeah. So how do you bring it together? So we've talked about finance, we've talked about the number of contracts, the amount of money we spend you know, and also my learning is that charities are not very good in terms of management information, being able to break some of this down, let's say, for example, into outcomes. Others are excellent, don't get me wrong, but I do find quite often it breaks down, for example, into outputs. Yeah? So the activities rather than the change we're creating. And so it's quite interesting to map off, if you like, the surplus or profitability or you know, surplus that we're generating from different activities and different work that we do against the impact and the change that we're creating. And, you know, here's a simple 2x2 grid. It's the thing that I would always work with social purpose organizations, charities, and social enterprises to tease this out. Yeah. And so you can see in the bottom left-hand corner here, where you've got a low impact, low surplus generating activity, for example, you know, it's neither making you money and it's also not being impactful. You really should consider stopping that work. It's very difficult in the charity and social purpose space to say, no, we're gonna stop doing things. But sometimes actually having a tool like this is really important. I've worked with so many boards who said, we really want to stop doing things, but don't have the tools to actually ask the questions, which things should we stop doing? This will give you that, yeah? And then if you look at the impact continuum on the left-hand side, if you've got something which is high impact, but actually costs you quite a lot of money, you're going to be having to ask, how do you keep costs down? How do you get better cost recovery? How do you charge potentially a little bit more for your services? Yeah, it's all about how do you make those more profitable to move you into this golden spot, which is high impact and high surplus generation. Yeah. So the top space there is where we're trying to get to. It's high impact and good, you know, profitability. But then there's the one in the bottom right-hand corner, which is really difficult. It's where you've got lots of money being generated, but impact is poor. So, for example, quite often I see charity shops. They create a surplus, they create money, but they're never used to talk about the charity per se. Yeah. So you have to ask yourself the question, how can we make these more impactful? And over the page, I've got an example then of some work that we did, you know, as the consulting team here. I've changed the detail here. It's not as it looked in the final report. Yeah. But I just hope you can see how this plays out. The size of the bubble is the reach. The impact is on the left-hand side, and the profitability or surplus or losses on the bottom. And where you have something like, for example, you know, personal shopper services, Meals on Wheels in the top right-hand corner, it might not have the scale, but those were considered very high impact and profitable services. And certainly the personal shopper service could be something that could be grown in the future, for example. Help at home services are, for example, on the left-hand side, how do we make those more profitable? Do we charge potentially a little bit more? How do we move them to that top right-hand, you know, square is the question. You know, fundraising, you know, it's very profitable. It's potentially low impact. Can we do more to tell the story of our beneficiaries and those we exist for in our fundraising? And then, you know, I've just put in one other here, an old day service in a non-purpose-built premises, low impact, low profitability. Would it be better if we actually closed, or would that be detrimental? It's always a difficult question. Yeah. So do you want to go forward to the next slide? And then I think we've got one slide left before we go to, you know, really great to hear how you ask, how do you make these more profitable? Absolutely, Karina. It's all about how do we make this more profitable. Let's just talk about the sweet spot, and then we're going to open it up to a big messy conversation, Helen. And we want the voices, we want people to, you know, chat. So the next slide, if you can. So here's our learning. Yeah. So back to that head and heart slide at the start. If you try to balance off head, i.e. the money, and heart, i.e. the impact and you try to balance off the two, quite often you can't do that. You know, research has shown that you have to take one of two positions. With social purpose organizations, start with the impact. Yeah, start as Helen has shown you, by understanding the impact, by looking at the indicative impact model, by articulating the change that you bring about. Yeah, that will lead you into a number of options, things that you could do or things that you might want to change, which you're then going to look at how you're going to fund, how you bring the money in against that, or back to the Karina point, how do you make that more profitable? You're going to need some financial modeling. You're going to need then to map off the impact and you know, the finances against the reach that you've got, and that will give you the idea of a plan. Then work out what your investment is to make that happen. Yeah. So an impact-led strategy process is really, for me, the most important thing. In other words, think of the most important thing, start with impact. Yeah. And back to the first question we started with, which we're going to come round to at the end. I believe that a lot of organizations are thinking too much of the money at the moment. We need to get back to the impact. We need to get back to the reason we exist. And that's the change we create for people. So hopefully this strategy process gives you some tools to go back and make, if you like, sort of the different steps towards getting you to a different model potentially. So the final slide I've got before we throw it open is just a personal reflection, and I know Steve, I know Karina, you'll be groaning at the moment, yeah. But I'm going to tell the little story for those that haven't, you know, seen this before. And I was a finance director for 15, you know, odd years. I never got impact until I sat with people, as I say, or when I went out to sit with, for example, animal welfare people that really cared about, you know, animals and cats, etc., or disability, or whatever I was working in. And so this is just a simple story about that. It's a village savings and loan scheme in Ethiopia. And you can see here the box in the middle is where the money is counted in. And then when a loan is made, you know, people pool the money together into the box. And then when a loan is made to set up a small business, it gets counted out into one of these bowls. Yeah. And so, you know, I was in the privileged position of saying to the woman in you know, this low income slum in you know, Ethiopia, what is your dream? Yeah. And they said, look, at the moment we're charcoal sellers. We walk 10 miles, we collect wood, we burn it, we create charcoal, and we sell it on the side of the road. We are extremely poor, but that is our business. And I said, what do you want to become? And they said, we want to make pancakes. We want to have eggs. We want to have, you know, milk. We want to have flour. We want to create pancakes. But also, as a woman in Ethiopia, to have a stall is a big thing, because it shows that we have ownership of land potentially. You know, and owning some animals would be a big step up for us to have some dignity and independence. And so, you know, what I never realized is that the money we spend, for example, creates all of this change, all of this, you know, these outcomes, and helps people to move from, for example, being, you know, charcoal sellers to being pancake makers, because that's what they really want to achieve. And we exist as charities, as non-profits, to help people to change, to live a different life, to mobilize in different ways. That's why I wanted to tell you the story. So as a finance person, I get my bit of the story. Yeah, I help create this change. And unless I understand the impact I'm trying to create, I really miss the fact that my finance drives and creates that. And it's just important to realize you've got to spend that money in the best way. Yeah, so that's why I wanted to tell that story. That's what I learned profoundly by just asking people. So back to this asking thing and stakeholder engagement, just asking people what change they wanted to see in their lives. We're going to move to the next slide, and it's really now just open to questions. So just to summarize where we've got to, we've brought finance, we brought impact into the same space. We're linking now our expenditure to the change we create. That's really powerful. And back to the first statement we made, which is finance people are much less able to see impact than others in the organization. We've got to help our finance staff to go on this journey. Yeah. And equally from the impact side, Helen, you know, sometimes you want to help. Yeah. We want to help as finance professionals, you to see in terms of impact and you to go on the journey with us. Yeah. So we need both sides of this equation. Absolutely. Final comment before we go for questions. Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I can only really echo what Mark said, and that slide about the head and the heart. You know, if the thing that makes charities in our sector unique is that we should have impact really at the heart of everything that we do, but we also need to be financially sustainable. And there's a little bit of a kind of I think there's a little bit of a stereotype about the impact people who tend to be hippie tree huggers and the finance people who tend to be kind of corporate sort of
tie wearing.
Yeah, I'll let you find the words, Mark. But actually we need to realise that we're all in this game for a reason, and that's because we want to make a difference, and both of our houses need to be in order in order to kind of make the biggest difference possible, really.
So we're going to now open to the floor. It's a messy chat now, and also participants, please, we really want you to sort of talk. So has anybody got a comment from what we've said so far? I've got a couple of questions, one from Dolly Anna, which I'll come back to, but let's just open up to people to talk or to put some comments in the chat box. Yeah, so over to you, over to the to the crowd, if you like, over to the participants who would like to say something, or type in the chat box, and we can talk from there. Blimey, I think everybody's gone to sleep. I bored them to tears. Kath.
Oh, we've got Kath. Should we, Kath?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll allow you to talk, Kath. Hopefully this will work.
Hello, Helen. Can you hear me?
Hi, yes, we can. Yes. Loud and clear, yes.
So, Mark, one of my comments is that as executives within the charity organisation, we're there to ensure that the trustees make sure that the beneficiaries are the reason what they're looking after. And I think it's so important that the trustees are always looking at the impact that any project has. And so that's why I'd slightly disagree with some of your statements, that actually that's the very heart of what we're doing. And when we put forward any proposal, particularly sort of the big restricted grants, we're always looking at impact, and we're always making sure that that's happened. So I think maybe you're not giving the finance guys in the charity sector enough credit for what they do and making sure that the trustees are always pushing the beneficiaries first.
Kath, I take your criticism wholeheartedly, and it's my opinion, having worked around consulting for probably 12 to 14 years. I see a lot of finance people that actually really don't step into that, and I just want them to improve. So I totally take your criticism. It's my opinion, but if I think if we can help finance staff to engage more with the work that organisations do, and to be able to articulate the impact. And I think that charity finance staff are particularly bad at articulating the impact that's created sometimes. That's what I think we should aim to do. So it is my opinion, Kath.
Fair enough.
So in terms of your organisation, can you give us a little bit more about how the trustees consider impact when you sign up? I'm just really interested for the webinar, just to actually hear from you.
So I'd say we're a very impact-driven organisation. So I've worked for a charity called Orbis, and we work in developing countries with healthcare professionals to improve how they treat avoidable blindness. And so our impact is actually quite huge, and it's also very sustainable. So if we have a healthcare professional trained by one of our volunteer faculty, that person then goes on to share their training, and then it's a virtuous circle. And so I think we're one of those organisations. We always look at the impact of what we're doing, and I mean, I think also our donors are really interested in impact, and we've been very led by that. So if you're getting large grants, they want to know what's the impact. We've got to justify that. So if you're doing a DFID or whatever they're called now, a CDO grant, you have to look at your impact. And so finance works really closely with the programme teams, and I would say that anybody in this sort of the sector is always thinking, because you said it yourself, why do we work here? Because we're interested in making change. And so maybe subconsciously you've always been aware of that impact, but you needed to actually talk to a beneficiary to actually understand it in that way.
Yeah, and I think also, Kath, it's so useful and so important that finance staff get out and go and meet, and rather than being seen as backroom people, are empowered to go and actually really understand the change that their work does bring about. And, you know, Paula Laird at WaterAid always said that, you know, finance saves lives. Yeah, that's what I really believe. Yeah, so I think we have such an integral part to play in the infrastructure and the work that we do. I just think it's really important, Kath, that we do understand the impact we create.
I agree. I mean, I think the importance of going to see programme, going into the field is really essential. And that's why we have in our organisation a policy that if you've worked within the organisation for 3 years and haven't been to the field, we will take you there.
Wow.
I'm going to give you the thumbs up. I'm going to ask really for other comments of people who agree or disagree. But Kath, thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks.
Go for it, Helen. What have you seen in the chat function? Or should we have somebody else who would like to talk? Should we open it up for another person who'd like to talk?
So there's a few people who've mentioned in the chat function. There's a little bit more conversation about what Kath is saying. So Sean says, you know, you could almost measure it on the fact that finance reports have been high on the agenda at trustee meetings than conversation about impacts, and that's sort of quite an interesting insight. And Claire as well is kind of talking about that finance professionals have a whole industry for financials, and yeah, I think that's a really good point, Claire. Would anyone else like to raise their hands and contribute to the conversation, or should we? I think there are a few questions as well in the chat function, and also the Q&A that we could tackle.
So who wanted to? Are we going to put it open to somebody else to make a comment, so that somebody else can actually join us, Helen? Yeah.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to put their hand up and I can unmute them?
Oh, Ben has raised something which is really quite difficult. This is Ben Hilliard. I find it difficult to get reliable metrics on activities, plus the CEO emphasises we're a non-profit and detest the word profit. I think a business approach is required in changing culture. Would you agree? Wow, Ben. You know, you are stepping into one heck of a conversation, and you know, my personal belief is I don't actually agree in some ways, and yet I totally agree in other words, because you know, we exist to actually do the best we can with the resources we have, to be the most efficient and effective we can. You know, with the money we have, that means that we have to understand how we spend our money and the return we get for our money. Yeah. I think, you know, that is different from a business approach, potentially, where it might be focused on something much more, if you like, unitary like sales, yeah, or money. I think we have a much greater complexity of things we do. On the flip side, we've got to use all the tools we can And business is very, very good at this, to drive the most efficient and effective we can, because our beneficiaries are worth it. Yeah. And we really do need to, if you like, sort of pull in some of the tools, for example, about good procurement practice, or one of the things I talk about an awful lot is getting the right infrastructure, you know, and spending more on overheads. I think that is something that, you know, the commercial sector is maybe, or the business approach is maybe better at. Yeah. So I think in summary, there are some things that in the charity sector is absolutely special, and we do it better than the corporate sector. There are some things in the corporate sector we really do need to learn, and we need to actually, like, sort of, you know, pull that over. So I don't see it as the charity sector needing to take on board the business approach. I think we can take the best of business and do it in our own way. Sorry, if people disagree with me on that, feel free, or equally, if people want to have a conversation around that, let's do that. So I've got a hand here.
We have a hand, yes. Claire, I will. Oh, she just put a hand down. Would you still? Yes, ooh, I will allow you to talk, Claire. Hi there.
Hi, no, thank you. Really interesting discussion. I actually wasn't going to comment on that, but there's another conundrum that I think we have, which is the strategy financial conundrum, or you could call it the strategy chicken and financial egg. Because what I hear, and I think we're all talking about the same thing, whether we use strategy or impact, it's two sides of the same coin. But what I often hear from a financial director, and I'm on the impact strategy side, so it's very interesting. And I think, you know, it's all about balance, actually, realistically. But I hear financial directors say we've got to cut our cloth accordingly. And then the sort of the visionary strategy person, possibly the chief exec, saying, well, if we're focusing on the cloth, we might be missing the fact that we don't even need a cloth. Or if we focus on ambition, then, you know, you free your mind. So I think it's the sort of the reductionist versus the ambition. And how do you kind of square that circle? So I've got noise in the background at the moment. And I think the answer probably is a balance. But
Claire, you've got to go and get an ice cream, please do.
Yes, absolutely.
Magnum for me, please.
I think, you know, it's one of those things, because I think, you know, you can't have one at the expense of the other, because if you're just focusing on cutting your cloth, you know, you're losing all ambition.
Yeah,
so I mean, that as another conundrum.
It absolutely is. I mean, Helen, do you want to comment, or shall I comment?
You go for it, Mark.
Yeah, I think it's really hard, because one of the other things that Annie Murphy has put into this is that trustees are legally responsible for sustainability. It's all part of this question around strategy. And what the Charity Commission guidance actually says is you have to think about three things as a trustee. One is the legality, fiduciary duties. One is the strategic, in other words, how you deliver to the best of the resources you have. And then the third is what is considered like innovation. It's called generative, Claire, yeah? Mm. And so what we're really talking about is, given what we're already doing, i.e. strategic, given that we're doing it legally, i.e. fiduciary, how do we create the space for our trustees to think about generative activities? And I think it's really hard, yeah, because especially when you have such financial pressures, and somebody says, for example, we've got to cut our cloth accordingly, they're feeling the pain of, you know, doing the business as usual and making survival work. On the flip side, it's really hard to then have conversations about doing things in a new way in the new world. And yet we've got to find that space to be able to do that. Does that strike a chord with you? Is that really where you... And then the second question is, how in your organisation have you created that space, or are you still struggling with that?
We are creating the space, but it's that ongoing tension. So we are running a strategy process, and there's an urgency for that. And in the conversations about cutting our cloth are happening in the background. And I'm a strategy director pushing back on the cutting the cloth conversations until the strategy process. But as a result of that tension, we're compressing the strategy, and it's going to be good enough. but I'm pushing hard to have those conversations around strategy and dreaming, you know, dreaming big, because if you don't dream big, you could find yourself collapsing.
Yep.
Incredibly difficult, kind of keeping that cutting the cloth conversation at bay. Please,
Yep.
with me, we will get there type thing. So we're in it at the moment. We're you know, this tension and managing it just.
And it's so difficult because it's iterative, you know, and I think unless you look at the size of the need that's out there and start to ask yourself the questions, well, how can we meet all of that need with this small amount of resource? It's very difficult to then challenge yourself to get into a new business model or to try something new. I mean, Helen, was there something else that you wanted to add to this?
It just sort of, it occurred to me a little bit. I wonder to what extent, you know, what the world's been through in the last 6 months and the radical change in the environment and needs and kind of the way that charities interact with their stakeholders, to what extent will that really kind of force that conversation to happen? I don't know, Claire, if that's sort of affected the kind of the argument in the way that you're pushing internally at all. Do you think it has sort of forced charities to really have that conversation?
Yeah, and you've said that in this climate, you know, there's a more of a focus on financials, and yes, I think we're just reflecting the outside world.
I'm just going to you know, finish off with one comment. I mean, and let's choose one each, Helen, and then we'll just summarize and I want to make sure that people finish by 5. Yeah. So I just want to go back to Doliana's question, which is what should be considered a good surplus in charity terms? I think that is a great question because you know, if we're talking about something that is, for example, never going to make money, never going to make a profitable return, a good surplus would be minimizing the amount of money we spend. Whereas if we're trading in something and we're selling, for example, a coffee and our beneficiary is somebody who is homeless, for example, who is helping, you know, and there's lots of organizations that give, for example, employment, then you want to do that on a commercial basis. And I think that, you know, having worked in social investment for a number of years, we talk too much about market rates of return when some things are not going to be profitable in that way. And yet it's really important to actually give people the dignity of activity and work and all of these things. But that might have a price tag associated with it. And so sometimes we're not talking about a perfect market, and a good surplus could be that we have to subsidize heavily to achieve the impact and the change we want to achieve. I hope that gives you an insight there as well, because not everything we do, sometimes we just need to spend money to save a life. Yeah, and you're never going to make a profit out of that. That's not what we're here for. But I hope that answers Doliana's question. That's a really good question about what is a good surplus. Helen, it's back to you.
It's back to me. So I'm gonna, I'll probably end on answering a question that we got from an anonymous attendee who said, management of self-assessment of service delivery can be very subjective. How do you arrive at a rational assessment that would be acceptable to board members? I think that's a really, really interesting impact question, and we probably don't have time to answer it enough now, but I think there's a few different ways that you could approach this. So the first one is you could bring some stakeholders into the board meeting and or bring some board members along to invite them to the places of impact, so the services that you're actually delivering to stakeholders, and kind of let them see it with their own eyes. You know, it doesn't necessarily arrive at a rational assessment, but they'll be there, their hearts and minds will be there, and they'll definitely remember all of those experiences, as Mark's story with what he found when he was working at care shows. The other angle is that there are things like assurance processes that you can get in impact. So Social Value UK runs an assurance service where you can do your impact study and then send it off for independent assessments and they'll kind of send it back with some recommendations or give it a seal of approval. So it's a little bit like an audit, but for your impact, and that's another angle that you could go from. But there's lots of different kind of ideas and approaches out there, and I think it's a really, really good question. But I'm also aware it's 5 o'clock, so I think really, Mark, we probably don't have time for a complete summary, although the questions were almost good summaries in themselves. So I'll just leave this up here, and yeah, again, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure. And clearly the tip of an iceberg for this conversation, you know, without overusing that metaphor. You can see here some of the upcoming webinars and events, so we'd be delighted to see you all again. But yeah, hope you all have a lovely evening. Thank you very much.